Good evening, this is Brown at IF Brown, and tonight we are going to be talking about RoboCop 2 on Blu-ray. So this is a movie that I saw a long time ago. We're talking way back when I was going to Quad C. And the first time I watched it, I didn't really like it, because it, paled in comparison to the original movie, and which was one of my favorites. But fast forward several years later, I watched it again, and I'm not gonna say it's a good movie, but it's a lot better than I remembered it being, and it's actually decent enough on its own merits. So let's get into it. So the story begins in old Detroit, like, much like the original, and unfortunately, in between the original RoboCop and this one, crime has gotten worse, and thanks in no small part to this new designer drug that's out on the street called Nuke, which is highly addictive and, basically puts, just about any other street drug to shame. And, RoboCop and Lewis, they're doing what they can to, fight crime, as well as, try and find the source of this, Nuke drug, because unfortunately, the police department is on strike, and Lewis and Murphy, aka RoboCop, are some of the only ones who are willing to try and put in the time to do what they can to help their city out. And RoboCop and Lewis eventually find out where the drug is being made. And they already know who's making it, and it's this guy named Kane, who is sort of this, cultish, criminal mastermind, and he has a sort of pseudo, messiah complex, except it's a very warped, version of, I guess, a messiah. But anyway, though. They find out, where the drug's being made, and RoboCop, decides to, take it upon himself to, go up against, Kane and his gang. But much like in the original movie, he, because he's by himself, he ends up, getting taken apart quite literally. And so, Kane and his gang, they literally, take RoboCop apart, and throw what's left of him, out in front of, the police headquarters. And because RoboCop is taken apart, they, end up putting him back together. But it's at this point that a woman by the name of Dr. Fax comes in, because she works with OCP, the company that's basically running and everything. And OCP at this point is trying to, create a, new RoboCop, aka a RoboCop 2. But unfortunately, all the other candidates they've tried for the program have gone insane upon becoming cyborgs. And, basically, Murphy, Alex Murphy as RoboCop was kind of a fluke, because, he was able to, regain his humanity and hold on to his sanity. And so Dr. Fax has the bright idea to try to use someone who is the complete opposite of Alex Murphy, namely someone who is psychotic, someone who is dangerous, a criminal. And she's thinking that, it'll be someone who has, no reservations about doing whatever it is that OCP wants done, and also it will be someone who is completely under OCP's thumb, because in this case, she's thinking that, hey, if we can get someone who is, say, like a drug addict or something, all we got to do is make sure that, the brain, is still eager for the drug, even though it's the only living part in the robot body. But in the meantime, she has to do something about RoboCop, to get him out of the picture. And so, she decides to reprogram him once he's put back together. And, basically, all his directives, all his OCP directives, turn him from a, capable law enforcement officer into someone who is, a politically correct to a fault, idiot. And so, he and Officer Lewis, they go on patrol, once he's, back online, but he ends up, being more concerned with lecturing the criminals on, their, lot in life, as well as, basically their how their choices have harmed others. Never mind the fact that these guys are trying to take pot shots at him and Lewis ends up having to take him down herself, and she ends up getting understandably fed up with RoboCop, and realizes that OCP did something to him. And so, she takes him back to, police headquarters where, they have some scientists who, they're trying to figure out, okay, how can we get all this, all these, directives out of him? And, the solution would have to be, RoboCop would have to, get shocked by a ridiculously high amount of electricity. But that suits RoboCop just fine. And, he's coherent enough to hear what they're saying. And so he storms out of police headquarters and, goes to like a power plant or something and, decides, okay, it's either I go back to my normal self or I'm dead, but anything's better than this. And so, he shocks himself and to a point that, he's, out of it for a little bit. But then, he comes back online and all the OCP directives are gone and he's back to his old self again. And so it's at this point that, he joins the police department and gets who up to this point were on strike. But, once he comes back online and, he leads the charge, in, taking down Kane and his drug empire. And but unfortunately though, it's sort of a good news, bad news situation, because RoboCop ends up taking Kane out of the picture, but in the process though, Kane, who is, at a point where he's about to die in the hospital, because of his, second run-in with RoboCop, is being eyed up by Dr. Fax, and it turns out that, as a nuke-addicted would-be messiah, drug lord, he is the perfect candidate for RoboCop 2. So she and her medical team, have Kane, killed in the hospital, and then they have his brain, put into, the RoboCop 2 body. And next thing you know, you have a drug-addicted, highly lethal RoboCop, that is out of control. But hey, it's just OCP policy. So anyway, yeah, that's the story in a nutshell. And it's a movie that there's a lot going on in it, and there are multiple stories going on to where, you get a glimpse of all these stories that the movie is trying to tell. But while these glimpses are fascinating, they don't necessarily come together very well until the very end, in which case, you have a rather memorable, final showdown between RoboCop and RoboCop 2. But, okay, the movie was directed by a guy named Irvin Kershner, and, most people remember him as the guy who directed Star Wars Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back, which has gone on to be regarded as arguably the best movie in the Star Wars franchise. And so, I think the people, who, were behind the scenes, thinking, okay, in theory, having Irvin Kershner, sort of repeat his, Star Wars success with, a RoboCop sequel makes sense because you had, Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope, which was directed by George Lucas. I mean, that was an iconic movie, and then when they did Empire Strikes Back, that was a sequel that was better than the original, and so I think they were kind of hoping that it'd be a similar success with RoboCop 2, because the original RoboCop, directed by Paul Verhoeven, was a classic movie, and it was hailed by critics as something that was new, groundbreaking, and it was definitely a memorable piece. But so to have Irvin Kershner come in and direct the second movie, in theory, it should have been a much better movie. But there are all sorts of factors involved to where, the movie that we got, ultimately, just wasn't as good as, I think a lot of people were hoping it would be. But on one hand, though, you have a lot of, returning, faces from the original. I mean, you have Peter Weller, he's back as Alex Murphy, aka RoboCop. And they have they had a new design on the suit, because the design in the original, it was such a difficult time for Peter Weller to work in. And while he did give an iconic performance in that movie, it was something that he didn't necessarily want to go through again. And so, basically he was saying, hey, if I'm going to be in a sequel, we got to do something about the suit. And so the suit that they made this time around, I think it was like fiberglass or something, or it was made out of fiberglass. But it was something that, while it looked, like the suit from the original movie, it was a lot more maneuverable, and it was a lot more comfortable or I should say, it was a bit more comfortable for Peter Weller to wear, to where he wasn't going crazy, in it. And so, but he actually turns in a pretty good performance again this time around, and you get a bit of a glimpse into, I guess, his mindset as far as how he's wanted to. On one hand, he's wanted to be a good police officer, and he's wanted to do right by a city and its citizens, as well as his fellow police officers. But at the same time, he's still got the lingering pain of having lost his family, and he tries to he kind of tries to make contact with them, but that doesn't go very well, and he's talked down by OCP staff, and is told that, hey, you're not a man, you're a machine, stop going after this poor woman, his wife. And so he ends up, it's a pretty good scene. He's basically telling OCP what they want to hear, that he's not Alex Murphy, he's RoboCop, he is a machine, he's product. And he has to tell his wife that, I don't know you, and they only put this face on this machine to honor your husband, but I don't know you. And it's a scene where you can tell that he wants to tell her that, hey, I remember you and I love you, but but at the same time he sort of a combination of going along with company orders, but also giving his wife I guess the chance to move on, as opposed to, say, forcing her to deal with a dead husband come back, who's not entirely human anymore. And so in that respect, I mean, I liked what Peter Weller did, and also you have the bit where after being put back together and having all these ridiculous OCP directives and put into his head, you have him basically being a parody of himself, sort of like a sing-songy happy RoboCop. And it was actually pretty funny to see, because I mean you get to see some of Peter Weller's comedic skills, because I mean he's having to keep a straight face while lecturing juvenile criminals on the dangers of tooth decay, so and stuff like that, and they're all like, what? or of course there's the bit where he's reading the Miranda to a corpse, that Officer Lewis had to she ends up having to literally yell at him that hey, you're reading to a dead guy. And so that was another thing. Nancy Allen, she's back as Officer Lewis, and she didn't have as much of a presence in this movie as she did in the first one. I mean, yeah, she gets second billing, and she has good chemistry with Peter Weller, but aside from that, she's just kind of there. But in the bit of time that the two of them are working together, and when RoboCop's going through that politically correct to a fault phase of his programming, she does a good job of playing off of that, because she's like, what the blank is wrong with you? And then she's having to point out the obvious multiple times, and while at the same time Alex Murphy, Peter Weller is playing off of her frustration, and he's just so happy and cheerful. So I mean you get some good comedic banter and chemistry between the two of them, but I really think though that their relationship, aside from the comedic points, it was kind of put on the back burner, because I mean there was a whole bunch of stuff going on in this movie, and you get a glimpse into I guess what their relationship could have been, as well as say Alex Murphy's inner turmoil with his wife and son. But you don't get a lot of time that deals with that though, and it just kind of goes on to the next thing and the next thing. And that was another thing. I liked the character of Kane. It's played by Tom Noonan, and he had a pretty good crew working with him. I mean, you had this little kid named Hob who was played by Gabriel Damon, and then you had this exotic femme fatale working with him named Angie, and she was played by the late I think it's Galen Gorg, and she was pretty good in her part, because she was smoking hot, but she was also loyal to Kane, to a point of honor before reason. And basically it was kind of like a twisted code of honor, in the sense that these are straight up villains that we're talking about here, but she has the whole we're not leaving Kane behind whenever he's put in danger, that kind of thing. And so she was a character who was both sexy and loyal and ruthlessly determined. And so it was interesting seeing that kind of character, but as a villain. And so, she was definitely a standout. And as far as Hob goes, I mean, he's literally a little kid. I think he must be like a child prodigy or something, or at least his character is supposed to be a child prodigy in terms of, the criminal underworld, but at the same time, he's sort of a mixed, blessing, because, I mean, on one hand, he's definitely memorable, in the sense that this is a little kid, sort of, acting as the number two for Kane, but at the same time, it's a little kid, it's kind of hard to take seriously. But anyway, though, Tom Noonan, I liked his character, And I liked the glimpse of the Messiah complex that he had, or I should say the pseudo Messiah complex, because I don't think he necessarily cared about saving people. I think he just used that kind of rhetoric to, you know, string people along, because deep down he just wants to watch the world burn, while getting high on nuke. But Tom Noonan, he's always been good at playing, sort of cold, eerie individuals. I mean, you check him out in the movie Manhunter. I mean, it's arguably what he's best known for. I like what we saw of him here. But at the same time, we don't get a lot of time to deal with, I should say, a lot of time to get to know his character. Unlike, say, in the original movie, you had the character of Clarence Boddicker, who was, he was, the guy who was the head of the gang that murdered Alex Murphy. But I mean, anytime you saw him, I mean, you remembered him, and he chewed the scenery, and he had a blast with it. But they don't, unfortunately, develop the character of Kane as much as they did Clarence Boddicker. And so so basically, Kane, I mean he's a decent villain, but he's unfortunately not that memorable, when, I guess you could say, when all's said and done. I mean, he's not, I mean, Tom Noonan doesn't do a bad job, and, the actors playing, his gang, they do a decent job too. It's just that, in terms of the screenplay, it's, so dead set on going from one scene to another in a very rapid, manner. So you basically get this fascinating glimpse of this, sort of dark, twisted family, that this gang is. But at the same time, you don't get a lot of time to get to know them, unlike, say, the gang in the original movie. So, I mean, I liked what I saw, but I wish I could have gotten to, hang with the gang a little more. And so, I mean, it just, the villains in this movie, I mean, as far as, the street stuff goes, I mean, they were okay. It's just, you're probably not gonna, remember them after you see this movie. But I will say, though, that, amongst other people who return in this movie is the old man, the guy who runs OCP, and him and, Johnson. I neglected to mention Johnson in my review of the original movie, but he was one of the other OCP executives. But he also returns, and he's kind of been promoted, I guess, to Dick Jones's spot. And Dick Jones was the main bad guy in the original movie, alongside Clarence Boddicker. But anyway, though, Johnson and the old man, they have a rather interesting dynamic, because in the original movie, both characters, you kind of got the idea, while they were corrupt, they weren't just outright scumbags. They had some, standards, some morals, I guess you could say. But in this movie, though, the old man and Johnson both are full-on corrupt. We're talking like Gordon Gekko type, corruption. But Dano Hurley, he's the guy who played the old man. He's having a blast playing this guy. The evil, businessman mastermind, and it's fascinating. Seeing him go from the morally gray character that he was in the original movie to straight up, enjoyably evil. In this movie, Felton Perry, he plays Johnson, and it was really interesting seeing him as kind of a Dick Jones type character in this movie, and I didn't really expect to see that kind of character transition for him, but so I guess in that respect, the villains, when it comes to the business side of things, stood out more than, say, Kane and his gang, simply because I didn't expect them to do what they did with these particular two characters. But yeah, there was another guy who shows up here. Is the mayor, Mayor Cusack, and I he was an interesting character. He was played by Willard E. Pugh, and I liked his character, because you get the idea that he's a corrupt mayor, but at the same time, he actually does care about Detroit and he is trying to save it. But OCP has him hopelessly outclassed, and so when you get the scenes where he's having a sit down with Kane's gang, to try and say, okay, we'll give you the money to be able to go up against OCP legally, but at the same time, once you're mayor, you've got to turn a blind eye to our distribution of the nuke drug, and so it was a fascinating glimpse of the dirty corporate politics. I guess you could say, as well as real world politics, because I'm pretty sure stuff like that goes on a lot more than we'd like to think. But anyway, though, yeah, Willard E. Pugh, he I liked how he played the mayor, because he was someone who was corrupt, but he had some standards. Like, he had some sense of morality, like say, okay, I'm going to do something that's morally questionable, but I'm doing it to try and save my city, because I actually grew up here and I care about the people here. And so I thought and see, that's the thing. You get so many fascinating glimpses of all these compelling stories in this movie, but you only get so much time with each story, before things kind of roll along to the next thing. But I did like that aspect of the movie when much like in the satire of capitalism gone awry in the original movie. Here you have corporate politics and sort of the seedy side of things, and I did like seeing that. But yeah, it just there are a lot of things I liked. It's just that we aren't really given enough of a chance to let things breathe. It's just really fast paced, and we take what we can get, and that leads to what is the third act of the movie, in which RoboCop ends up going up against RoboCop 2, aka Kane, in his new mechanical form. And that's where the movie's enjoyable on its own merits, up to to a point, but when it gets to this third act, though, this is where it's like, okay, bring on the popcorn, let's this is going to be fun. And because you basically have the same special effects crew that worked on RoboCop, I believe it was Phil Tippett and his crew. They did the stop motion animation for Ed 209 in the original movie, but when it comes to what they do for RoboCop 2, aka Kane, the Kane RoboCop, they pull out all the stops, because this is something that's like, in an interview, I think someone who worked on the movie said that this was like the Swiss knife, the Swiss Army knife of RoboCops, and because it's like he's got all these arms, he's got all these weapons, and is a terrifying mechanical monstrosity who's also addicted to nuke. So you have this drug addicted former criminal mastermind running or the brain thereof running around in this robot body, and it's just a terrifying concept. And contrary to OCP's PR, they have very little control over this thing. And when RoboCop ends up facing off with RoboCop 2, you have a brutal showdown. It's just like a good solid prolonged fight scene, heavy metal. and you could definitely tell that they put a lot of effort into choreographing this fight, um, and so I mean that's something that for me made the movie worthwhile, because the first act, the first and second act were, they weren't bad, but they were just sort of okay, they're there. But then when you get to this third act, though, with the RoboCop versus RoboCop 2, that's when it's just like, hold on to your lug nuts. This is going to be fun. So, but yeah, this was it definitely made the movie worthwhile for me, and it was. And I hate to say this because I honestly think that the stop motion animation and just the design of RoboCop 2 was better than the stop motion on Ed 209 in the original RoboCop. And Ed 209 was a memorable creation, to be sure, and was a terrifying robot in its own right, but they did a lot, were able to do a lot more special effects in this movie, and to where, there was more of a flow of movement when it came to, RoboCop 2, I guess. And basically it's just, I also appreciated how the design of RoboCop 2 was, unique. Like they could have just, had another Ed 209 with a few differences, but this was like a wholly original creation, and it was definitely a memorable antagonist, and it made for a very awesome final battle in the movie. But one other thing was that I guess you could say the satire in this movie, it tends to be a lot more mean-spirited, I guess, and than say in the original movie. And the original movie had a mean spirit about it as well, but there was kind of a, because of the focus on, I guess, the humanity in the movie at certain points, it didn't come across as quite as cynical as say this movie, because in all honesty, there's not necessarily, it doesn't really feel like, a world that has much in the way of hope. It's like RoboCop and Lewis, are doing what they can, but they can only do so much. And you kind of get the impression that things aren't necessarily going to get better. OCP is just going to go on and doing its own doing its thing and trampling, the civilians of old Detroit. Or if OCP ends up, getting, taken out of the picture, well, this next big company is going to be doing the exact same thing, And as far as like the satire and stuff, it was funny, but it was a lot more cynical than it was in, say, the first movie, though. So, whereas the first movie, it started in, horror and tragedy, but it ended in, triumph. This one's more like, a darkly comedic, laugh, and it's sort of like all you can do is laugh, in order to, keep your head up, in this, maelstrom of chaos. And I guess that's kind of, how I feel about, the movie in general. Like it's chaos, but it's a fun kind of chaos. And I think that another thing about it, like the reason it might be that way, in fact, there was a documentary on the Blu-ray here. It was called the Corporate Wars: The Making of RoboCop 2, and it's a very informative documentary. And once I watched it, I was able to understand why the movie was as chaotic as it was. Because it started off as one thing, and then it would go to another. And as far as story goes, and they had very little prep time. They had to have it, within a certain amount of time that was very, confining. And whereas, in the first movie, they had a little more leeway in terms of, when the movie needed to be made. But in this case, it was more like, it has to be done, da 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 da. And so everyone involved was kind of on the edge the entire time. And I mean, some of the people who made the movie, like, they have some fond memories of the movie, but they also have some really lousy memories, simply because they weren't able to just, breathe with the movie. It was like they were on edge the entire time. And the movie was actually, it was originally going to be, done by the same people who did the original movie. I mean, it was going to be, Paul Verhoeven directing, and the original screenwriters, they were going to come back. And the initial idea of, for RoboCop 2 under their hands, sounded very fascinating. It was going to be kind of a sort of a apocalyptic story, because RoboCop was going to be, taken out by a mortar shell, but then ends up being rebuilt 25 years later, and would end up basically befriending and falling in love with this computer program that was in charge of, I guess, security or something, or it was something about, it was either security or the city, or something. But basically, RoboCop in a sentient program, having a relationship. I mean, that right there, sounded like a fascinating, ground to explore, for a science fiction movie. And since it was going to be kind of an apocalyptic movie, they could have done so much to, convey, a twisted future. But unfortunately, things didn't work out like that, because, the studio was saying, we have to have the movie this right here, right now. And so, Verhoeven and the screenwriters were like, hey, we just have an idea here. We don't even have a full script yet. And so they ended up leaving. And so that's when, they got, a comic book writer, Frank Miller, who, while a controversial figure, has undeniably done some, groundbreaking work in the comic book industry. He's the guy who did Ronin, The Dark Knight Returns, Sin City, and he also redefined the character of Daredevil, and made him, kind of an A-list character. But so this was his first time working on a screenplay for on a movie, and he had some really cool ideas, and it was a very complex story apparently, but it was just too chaotic, and a lot of it would have been unfilmable apparently. And so they brought in a guy by the name of Waylon Green, who, amongst other things, he worked on the Sam Peckinpah movie, The Wild Bunch. And so, he ended up coming in and, doing a lot with the screenplay, to where, Frank Miller, you have some of what Frank Miller, was going for, but, apparently Waylon Green was, the guy who was saying, okay, yes, it's cool, but we need to be able to actually put this in film, and so, they had there was a lot of back and forth, not just with the two of them, but there was also just a lot of going back and forth with the executives. And when Irvin Kershner was brought in, to direct the movie, he, was basically fighting, a losing battle from the minute he came on, because he was brought in, a good amount of the way, into the movie, and he didn't have enough, time to prepare, apparently. And so, just basically, everyone in this movie, they had a very chaotic time in making it, but I mean, and this is where I kind of feel sorry for Irvin Kershner, because and according to his documentary, he was saying that he after he did RoboCop 2, he was wanting to do one more movie, a science fiction movie, and it would have been a remake of Forbidden Planet, which you get a chance, check that movie out. It's a classic. That's where Robbie the Robot came from. But anyway, though, I think what was kind of going through his head was that hey, RoboCop 2 is going to be a success, and I'll be able to do that and make my final movie, and that'll be my retirement. But unfortunately, though, his time working on RoboCop 2, it was just so disheartening that this after he did this movie, and the lackluster reception it got, it was just kind of like, okay, I'm done. And this was the last movie he made, and which was kind of a bummer, because I mean, it's not a bad movie, but at the same time, it's just, I can understand, after having seen this documentary, I can understand why a lot of people had some negative feelings towards it as far as making the movie. But on its own merits, though, I mean, it's not a good movie, but it is entertaining, though, and it's fascinating in its own way. And if you just bear in mind that it's not as good as the original, and it's not quite, it doesn't have the staying power that the original does, but it's, if you wanted to get some to watch on a Friday night or something like that, that was occasionally thought-provoking, but you kind of have to check your brain at the door. But then you have you have a really good third act that makes you sit up and take notice and bring on the popcorn. I mean, RoboCop 2 is actually a pretty good way to go here. So I'm going to go ahead and give RoboCop 2 3 out of 5 stars. It was decent on the second time around, and I had a good time watching it. And I'm kind of I am bummed out that we didn't get the RoboCop 2 movie that could have been. But at the same time, what we did get, though, was memorable in its own right. So I mean, you could definitely do a lot worse than this movie here. So thank you for taking the time to check out my review. Y'all got any questions, comments? Let me know. Y'all have a good night. Bye.